Thank you, Linda. And hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Leson, President of the NCWC Education Fund. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation titled Social Housing and Human Rights, Mobilizing for Change. Before we begin our event today, let us acknowledge and respect the Indigenous peoples of all the lands on which we have a presence. Let us reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to the protection of the land which we each call home. Let us acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and let us consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. The Education Fund was set up as a charitable foundation in 2001 to work with the National Council of Women of Canada by providing research and public education on the environment and the social, mental, physical, and health needs of women, families, and communities. At our AGM in 2023, the membership decided our focus for the Common Program for the next 2 years would be on the social needs of communities and chose housing is a human right. Today, we're very pleased to have you join us, along with our guest speaker, Kirsten Bernas, in exploring where we are, where we need to go, and how to mobilize to bring life to our common theme. I would now invite Karen Monin-Dempsey, Treasurer of the Education Fund and past President of the NCWC, to introduce our guest speaker. Karen.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce Kirsten Bernas. She is currently the Director of Policy Advocacy at the West Central Women's Resource Center in Winnipeg. She has also been an active member of the Winnipeg-based Right to Housing Coalition for the past 15 years and has helped coordinate the National Social Housing and Human Rights Project, which began in 2022. Both initiatives focus on the urgent need for our governments to reinvest in social housing. Please welcome Kirsten.
Thank you so much. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me here and for that nice introduction. Before I get into my presentation, I'm just going to speak a little bit more about the work that I do right now and how I'm able to participate in this advocacy work that Karen talked about there. So I work at West Central Women's Resource Center. We are a resource center for women and gender diverse people. They can come to access their basic needs. And we also have a whole bunch of programming. I used to manage our housing programs there, where we would help connect people to safe and affordable housing. And so, we offer a lot of really important services to people on the ground in our communities when they need them in the moment. And a lot of those services that we are providing because our systems are failing our communities and aren't, setting folks up to be able to meet their basic needs on their own. So our board and the executive director of our organization really strongly believe that while we do this work to meet people's basic needs on a day-to-day basis, it's really, really important that we are also working to change our systems so that, folks don't have to come to see us to access food and hygiene products and come to us for, showers and doing their laundry. And that when they are in need of, a new safe unit to live in, that we can very easily connect them to the type of housing they need, and they don't have to stay in shelter or, experience periods of homelessness. So because we so strongly believe in that, I am able to spend a lot of my time now, basically full time, doing work to support the coalitions that Karen mentioned. So the Right to Housing Coalition here in Manitoba and the Social Housing and Human Rights Coalition at the national level. So in terms of, what I plan to talk about today, I'm going to focus a lot of it on the national work that we're doing, because I do think that's something that wherever you are in Canada, you can think about how to support the work we're doing there and get involved with the advocacy with our federal government. So I'm going to talk about that, and I have some slides I'll share while I do that. And then I will get into some of the work that we do here in Manitoba, because that coalition has been around quite a lot longer than the work we've been doing at the national level. So I don't have any slides for that. I'll just, you'll be able to see me speak. And depending on how much time we have at that point, I can provide more or less detail about the Manitoba work specifically, but I do think there's lots to learn from what we've been able to do here over the past 18 years or so. And then we'll do a, time for discussion and questions. So I just give me one moment here while I try to pull up my slides. Okay, can everybody see the slide?
Perfect.
Okay, and then when I advance it, you can see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll also start my timer to try to keep myself on track. So what is the problem that we're looking at today, and that we're looking at in these coalitions that I'm a part of? So we have more than 2.68 million Canadians in core housing need. So this term, core housing need, this is a Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation term, where they consider a household to be in core housing need when their housing falls under one or more of these following standards: adequacy, suitability, and affordability. So if the housing is in need of major repairs, or if you don't have enough bedrooms for the size of the household, or if your housing costs are more than 30% of your household income, then the household is considered to be in core housing need. It just needs to fall under one of these categories. And we know that across Canada, 28% of women-led households are in core housing need. On top of this, we have anywhere from 260,000 to 300,000 Canadians experiencing homelessness. It's difficult to get an exact count of the numbers of people experiencing homelessness because it's changing all the time, and it's really hard to track that data. But this range comes from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They're one of our national partners. And there's a national group focused specifically on women's housing insecurity and homelessness. They're called the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And they have done work estimating that about 36% of this total number are made up of women. And that's also really likely to be an undercount. We know that women are often not counted when we do point-in-time counts of people experiencing homelessness in our communities, and that's because women often experience hidden homelessness. So they're not staying in our shelters as much as men, and they're often, staying with a friend or family or an acquaintance, or maybe they're living in housing with an abusive partner because that's the only opportunity they have to be sheltered. But, when we consider, what is safe and secure housing, or what is to having your housing needs met, that means being in safe housing. So that type of housing insecurity and homelessness is not often counted when we look at data around homelessness. So we have a very significant problem here, and many of us here in Manitoba and across the country are working to address housing insecurity and homelessness through these public policy advocacy coalitions that are focused on doing research on this issue, public education, and then advocacy around policy solutions. And we've learned that, we have a long and really failed history here in Canada and across the world of relying on the private sector, the private housing market, to meet the housing needs of people who are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. And we believe that this need will not be met unless our governments at all levels take leadership and start to reinvest in social housing. So the critical piece of our work is promoting these evidence-based public policy solutions that come from the research we do to generate broad support from the public. But most importantly, we promote it to all levels of government, because this is really where we need leadership and action to come from ultimately. And our federal government really has an obligation to take action. So we have a National Housing Strategy Act that was passed in 2019. And the legislation affirms that the government's housing policy is based on the recognition of the right to housing as it is understood in international human rights law. So the legislation brings Canada in line with international standards that require the right to housing to be ensured through policies, programs, independent monitoring, and access to hearings and effective remedies. It also requires the government to implement reasonable policies and programs to ensure the right to housing for all within the shortest possible time frame. And it means that priority must be given to vulnerable groups and those in greatest need of housing. So we have this legislation here in Canada, and for us, prioritizing the expansion of deeply affordable social housing is one way that government can prioritize groups in greatest need of housing and help achieve the right to housing in Canada. So what is social housing anyway? Social housing, how we define it, is non-market housing. So it's removed from the market. It cannot be used for speculation or to generate wealth. And rents are set at a level that ensures the household spends no more than 30% of their income on their rent. Or for those who are eligible for social assistance, rents would be set at whatever social assistance rates provide. And then the difference between what the tenant pays and the cost of providing the unit is covered through a government subsidy that's tied to the unit. So the housing provider gets a subsidy to be able to continue to operate. Now that 30% of income threshold, that's based on how the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation defines affordable housing. So they consider housing to be affordable if it costs less than 30% of the household's total income. So for us, one piece of the definition of social housing is how rents are set. And then the other piece is about ownership. So social housing, it can be owned by the government and then operated by either governments or nonprofits, but it can also be owned and operated by nonprofit housing providers and cooperatives. And they would receive ongoing subsidies from the state through agreements that ensure the units that they provide to rent are available at these social housing rent rates. It's important to note that social housing cannot be owned by the private sector. So this is the type of housing that we are focused on in our advocacy and that we're urging governments to protect and expand. But so far, governments at all levels have resisted policy around social housing. Let's look at what the federal government has been doing in recent years. So in 2017, it launched and invested in a 10-year national housing strategy. And this is something that Right to Housing here in Manitoba advocated for alongside many other partners across the country. And it included some specific goals tied to homelessness and housing insecurity, which I've noted on the slide. And so we were really looking forward to seeing what this strategy would mean for social housing across Canada. And then when we were about halfway through the 10-year life of that strategy, the National Housing Council, which was a group established to advise the Federal Minister of Housing, especially on the National Housing Strategy policies, this group, it issued a contract to analyze how well the key programs in this strategy were aligning with the needs of those who are experiencing core housing need and homelessness. And then in February 2022, the report with that analysis came out. So what were the results? Well, they looked at the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. This has a new name now. It's called the Affordable Housing Fund. It's the second largest program in the strategy. And at the time, it had about 10,000 units planned or completed. And under this program, they found that about 50% of the units created were unaffordable to middle income households. So really only affordable to higher income households. And approximately 65% of the units were unaffordable to low income households. Then they looked at the rental construction financing initiative. Now it's called the Apartment Construction Loans Program. This is the largest program in the strategy by total funding. And at the time, it had about 20,000 units planned. And they found there that more than 60% of the units created were unaffordable to middle income households, and about 97% would be unaffordable to low income households. And the most shocking thing we learned was that in both programs, and these are, quote unquote, affordable housing programs, nearly all units were expected to be unaffordable to people who are experiencing homelessness and people with very low incomes. So folks, relying on social assistance rates or for other reasons have very low incomes. And those are the majority of households in core housing need. The National Housing Strategy has only one program really that targets this type of social housing that we talk about. It's called the Rapid Housing Initiative. It actually wasn't even introduced until 3 years into the strategy, sort of as an afterthought. And since then, the government has invested about $4 billion into that program for a total of about 15,300 units, which is great because these units are really desperately needed. But that accounts for a very, very small amount of the total money committed and the total units that have been created through the strategy. So a lot of people don't really understand that this is what has been happening with the National Housing Strategy investments. And one of the reasons for that is because of the way the different programs are defining the term affordable. So I mentioned that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation defines affordable housing when rents are less than 30% of the household's total income. Now, the Globe and Mail published an article just this month, which takes a closer look at one of the programs that I mentioned on the previous slide, the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. This is the largest program in the National Housing Strategy. And that one, it considers housing to be affordable if the rent is less than 30% of median household income of all families in the particular city where the housing is built. So that is different from the CMHC definition where we're looking at just the income of the household. We're comparing it to the household income of all families in a particular city. So for example, the Globe found that in the case of one development in Ottawa, a one-bedroom unit under this, quote unquote, affordable program was starting at $1,760 a month, plus utilities, because that rent is actually only about 17% of the median household income of all families in Ottawa. But that rent amount looks much pricier when you compare it to a different number that some would argue would be a better indicator of affordability, and that would be the median income for renters as opposed to all households. So in Ottawa, that is $41,800, and that would make the rent for this one bedroom more than half of a typical renter's income. So the affordability measure in this program, it uses median household income of all families, which includes renters and homeowners. And homeowners outnumber renters, and they have incomes that are nearly twice as high. So that sort of increases that total income threshold. And then on top of that, the measure, it only looks at the income of family households, so not all households. So that excludes households with single people living alone or living with roommates who generally have lower incomes than family household income. And so that would bring the total number down if they included, single households, but they don't. So it would be a better measure of affordability in this program if it used median renter income as opposed to median household income, and if it included all household types. But really nothing, in our opinion, is as good as that CMHC definition at the top of the slide, where rents are not based on what would be affordable to other households in your community, but instead based on what is actually affordable to the household that's renting the unit that we're talking about. Another thing the Globe analysis discovered is that affordability measure that they use actually allows for rents higher than what landlords could even really expect to charge in the market. So in Winnipeg, there were 4 projects that had higher average affordable rents than the average market rent in the city. And one of the highest was here in Winnipeg at a 270 unit project that was designated for seniors. It received an $87 million loan from the federal government, and rents there were listed at $2,018 a month. And meanwhile, the average market rent for a comparable apartment in Winnipeg would be $1,427. And when you look at the amount of money a person gets per month when you're on social assistance here, it's about $950 to $1,000 to pay for your rent. It's clearly falling short of what these affordable units are charging. So these units are not going to be affordable to those folks and to many other low income and even middle income households. So when we hear governments talk about investing in affordable housing now, these analyses that have come out have really caused us to pause and ask, okay, who? Affordable to who? And in the Globe analysis, that program funded 177 projects, and half of the projects had affordable rents, quote unquote, that are not affordable to the typical household that rents rather than owns. And for single income renter households, only 11 of the projects were affordable. And for minimum wage workers, just nine projects were affordable. So even, folks who aren't working, again, relying on social assistance, people experiencing homelessness, we don't expect them to be able to afford units in any of these projects. And landlords who were interviewed by the Globe for that analysis, they said that, if the program had used a lower affordability measure, yes, that would result in cheaper rents, obviously, but profit margins would be too small or non-existent, and the housing just would not have gotten built, which reiterates the point that we are always making in our work, which is that we cannot rely on the private market to build housing for the lowest income households. It is not profitable. We don't expect the private sector to do that. It's not part of its role. So we really need our governments to step in and do that. So right to housing here in Manitoba, we were very concerned when some of the analysis on affordability started coming out already initially in 2022. We have all this public money going toward housing, and very, very little of it was going toward the people who need it most. And it became clear that if the federal government was going to have was going to reach the goals of its strategy that I had put on one of those slides, the goals around housing insecurity and homelessness, we really needed something to change in its strategy quite quickly. So we thought, well, we don't want to do this work from Manitoba by ourselves. We engaged with partners at the national level who are doing housing advocacy. So Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Canada Housing and Renewal Association, and the National Right to Housing Network, among others, to see, what are they doing? Can we support the advocacy that they're doing around the strategy? And these organizations all did include calls for social housing in the advocacy work, but it was always part of a number of other priorities that they, were urging the federal government to adopt. So it was sort of at that time in 2022, we identified here in Manitoba the need to bring people together nationally around a campaign that would uniquely focus on social housing, so that could really get the attention that it needs. So in 2022, the Manitoba Research Alliance, it's a Winnipeg-based research and policy consortium. We successfully applied for SSHRC grant, so that's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Connections grant. So we wanted to implement what we call the Social Housing and Human Rights Project. And the goal there was to work with social housing researchers and activists across Canada to put together all the existing research around social housing, develop a mobilization plan around the specific actions that we need governments to take to expand social housing across Canada. And so our look at housing policy in places like Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, throughout Europe, it all really led us to conclude, as does this, one of the photos on the slide is a report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There, they conclude that social housing has been a key part of our past housing policy and really needs to be a part of future housing policy. In Canada, we were committed to social housing development after the Great Depression for a couple of decades, but then we began to step away from it in the early 1990s at the federal level. And since then, very, very few new units of social housing have been built. And old funding agreements for our existing social housing are now expiring. And so we're starting to lose some of the units that we have. So our synthesized research, really tells this story of a now 30-year plus experiment that was aligned with the rise of neoliberalism to rely on the private sector to respond to all of our housing needs. And it just has not worked and has resulted in a large demand for good quality, non-market housing where rents are geared to income. So through this project funding, we held a conference last year in April to bring here in Manitoba at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. We brought over 100 researchers and advocates from all provinces and territories, and there was overwhelming agreement on the need for government action on social housing. And so those who were in attendance agreed they'd collaborate on the development of sort of this national call to action that we could use to mobilize advocates within our communities across Canada to urge the federal government to invest in social housing. We recognize that, many strategies need to be implemented at the same time to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. They need, rental support. We need strong rent regulations in the private sector. We need investments in supports for people who are in housing so they can maintain their tenancies. All of these things are really important. So is expanding social housing supply. And there is no focused campaign at the national level. And so that is what we have decided to move forward on. Those other priorities are important and need to be part of this package, but because nobody else was focusing exclusively on social housing, that would be our focus. And so a month later, last year in May, the participants at this conference reached a consensus on our call to action. And so this is it here. We call on the Prime Minister and the Minister of Housing to fulfill their legal obligation to realize the human right to housing and create a minimum of 50,000 net new rent geared to income social housing units each year for 10 years, starting now. These units should be targeted for those experiencing core housing need and homelessness and have rents permanently set at no more than 30% of household income. And then the second piece is to invest in the acquisition, construction, operation, and maintenance of new and existing public, nonprofit, and cooperative-owned housing that meets the unique and varied requirements of people experiencing core housing need and homelessness. So this has formed the basis of our work since May of last year. And I'm just going to walk us through some of the specific pieces in this call to action that I've bolded here. So 50,000 units, that we're asking for net new units, and that we want to see investments in acquisition, construction, operation, and maintenance. Before I do that, though, I just want to mention, too, that one of the things that came up at this conference when we were developing this call to action was, different groups highlighting the what we talk about in that very last part of the call to action there, which is the unique and varied requirements of the different people that are experiencing core housing need and homelessness. So they would say, well, we have to say something about, specifically about housing for women, or housing for Indigenous peoples, or, people with disabilities, we need accessible housing, and we need to add all of this to the call to action. And where we landed was that, yes, we do need to look at the specific demographics that are in need of this type of housing. But unless we get the government to make a funding commitment to build any amount of new units, it won't matter, what the needs for women are, what the needs for Indigenous peoples are. So let's stay really focused on getting a commitment first from government to invest in building new units across Canada. And once we get that commitment, then we can really work with government to say, okay, you're going to do this. We need to make sure that a certain percentage of those units are dedicated to, each of these different demographics. And the really great thing is, we do have organizations nationally that are focused on, particular demographics. So I mentioned the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. We have a great partnership there where when we're doing our advocacy around this call to action, they are also doing their own advocacy that complements this, saying we support social housing and human rights campaign's call for 50,000 net new units. And as a women's specific coalition, we are calling for X percentage of those units to be dedicated to women. So our hope is that other national organizations that are focused on a particular demographic will partner with us in the same way, so we can deliver a consistent message in terms of the overall need, while also finding ways to highlight the unique housing needs of specific demographics. So yes, I wanted to get into some of the details. Why 50,000 units annually for 10 years? This is a kind of a math-based slide, so bear with me. But we've been asked, this seems like this isn't enough. Where did you get this number from? So I'll just tell you quickly. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation projected the need to expand our overall housing supply across Canada by 5.8 million homes over the next decade. So that's 580,000 units annually over 10 years. And we estimate that about 33.5% of households are renters. Oh, sorry, we don't estimate that. The data estimates that. So that says we need about 194,300 rental units annually. And the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation says that approximately a quarter of our renters are in core housing needs. So a quarter of those 194,300 units, that comes to 48,575 units. So if you round that up, at least 50,000 new rental units should be provided at rent geared to income rates and targeted for low-income renters if we're going to address core housing need. And this number, it more than triples the target for affordable homes that was in the National Housing Strategy, and it redirects the focus of the strategy away from, those definitions of affordable housing, which really aren't that affordable to low-income people, to truly, deeply affordable housing. And it's also a number that is pretty consistent with calls from groups like the Scotiabank and others who want to double the number of social housing units to more closely align with average nations within the Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development. Why do we call for net new social housing? So that is really important, that word net, because we are losing social housing units all the time across Canada as a result of these operating agreements that are expiring. Also because we are not investing in maintaining the quality and the condition of our existing stock. So we really have to maintain what we already have if adding new units is going to increase our overall supply. So by calling for these net new social housing units, we're also calling for measures to protect the existing stock. So yes, we say we need investments in acquisition, construction, operation, and maintenance. So we need new social housing supply can be achieved by building, so we can construct new units, or we can acquire existing properties that can be repurposed or renovated. And we think Canada needs to do both, and this will require significant capital investments. And then in order to make sure we don't lose any units, like I just talked about on the previous slide, social housing providers are going to need to be able to maintain their properties and keep them in good condition. And this is going to require ongoing capital investments to do things like replace roofs or upgrade heating systems over time. And then finally, social housing providers need to find ways to cover the cost of operating their housing while charging tenants those rent geared to income rents, because that doesn't cover the operating costs. And this is why it's no surprise that the private sector does not supply RGI housing. Can't make a profit that way, never mind break even. So social housing providers require these ongoing government subsidies to close that revenue gap between what they earn from those really low rents and what they need to remain viable. Okay, next slide. What about other levels of government? So we're focusing obviously very much on the federal government, and we know that, you know, the expansion and preservation of social housing in Canada is going to require significant funding commitment from the feds. That's the level of government that has really strong revenue generating capabilities to make those investments. But at the same time, we know that provincial, territorial, municipal levels of government, they all have really important roles to play as well. So we encourage individuals and organizations who are involved in our national work to come together and bring folks together at their local level to develop and implement strategies that target their local levels of government that would complement the work we're doing at the national level. So what has our campaign been up to? We officially launched just in November of 2023. And we, since that time, have been working to gather endorsements. So we have, I think, over 105 organizational endorsements now. If you are part of an organization that has not yet endorsed the campaign, we encourage you to do that. And we really want to build this number up to demonstrate the strength behind our coalition and let political decision makers know that there's a lot of support for the type of investments we're calling for. We've also been engaging directly with members of parliament. We've sent everyone a letter to let them know about the campaign, and we've started to meet with them one-on-one. And we really wanted to make a push for some action in the 2024 budget. So we started a letter writing campaign in the new year and encouraged individuals to contact Liberal cabinet ministers directly and urge them to respond to our call to action in the budget. And I think we had over 125 submissions that were passed along to the cabinet in the weeks leading up to the budget. So how did Budget 2024 do when it comes to social housing? Well, it did not identify a target. We called for the 50,000 units for the number of new units of social housing. It did provide an additional $1 billion over 5 years to this affordable housing fund that would support the development of, you know, non-market housing, so housing owned by public, nonprofit, and co-op providers. This is the program that I referred to in an earlier slide, which was not expected to generate housing that was really affordable to very low-income people. So it's not particularly helpful in that sense, but they did make a commitment to create a stream within this fund that would build what they called, quote unquote, deeply affordable housing, which I think will be this rent geared to income housing that we want to see. And it sounds like that may be where the $1 billion is going. So it's not clear how many new units will be produced with that, but based on previous rounds of investments in, you know, deeply affordable housing, we expect this $1 billion investment to generate less than 5,000 social housing units over 5 years, right? So that works out to 1,000 units annually, which is 2% of the annual need that we've identified in our campaign. So it's something, but it falls far short of what we would like to see. And it's important to note that this funding, it's just capital money. So it's just money to build units. It does not provide those operating subsidies that housing providers need to charge those really deep rents. So without other levels of government matching and providing that operating funding, we won't see any new deeply affordable units with this fund alone. The budget also included a $1.5 billion rental protection fund. This actually aligns with the acquisition piece of our call to action. It's a fund that would allow the nonprofit sector to acquire, purchase existing affordable housing supply in the market that is at risk of being bought up by a for-profit company who would then renovate and maybe increase rents to a level that would be unaffordable. So we're really happy to see that. Again, it's the case, it's just a capital fund. So without partnership from other levels of government, if a nonprofit provider in Manitoba used the fund to purchase a building here, it wouldn't be able to charge those really deeply affordable rents without a commitment from our provincial government to provide those ongoing operating subsidies. So apart from these, really modest steps in the right direction, the federal budget really continues to rely primarily on failed policies that focus on incentivizing the private sector. And so the focus is going to continue to be on expanding the supply of, that quote unquote affordable housing in the programs that I've talked about that are really only going to be affordable to middle and high income households. So there was a lot of talk after the budget was released about all these investments in affordable housing, and we know when you dive deeper into what that means and who that housing is affordable to, that there is very little for housing that is affordable to those in greatest need. So we were disappointed as a campaign with that. But at the same time, we have launched very recently. We are sort of in the beginning stages, and we're also modest with our expectations. We are encouraged. We've got a lot of support from across the country. Folks are excited that there is now a campaign that is focused only on social housing that they want to lend their time to. So we're really motivated to keep moving forward. So in terms of our next steps, we, because of what we've sort of talked about today around people not fully understanding what is being funded through our federal government programs, we want to have a webinar soon to sort of debrief the budget and be really clear about what it means for social housing, and what it means for other levels of affordable housing. We haven't set a date for that yet, but we're hoping to do that fairly soon, obviously, just to follow up on the budget. And then we're also going to continue to do outreach to individuals and organizations to encourage them to endorse our campaign and send a letter to cabinet ministers to let them know they want to see more leadership on social housing. So if any of you have access to a cell phone right now that you can pull up your photo as though you were going to take a photo of these QR codes on the screen on my slide, and it'll take you right to the page on our site on your phone where you can send a letter to cabinet or endorse the campaign. And if you can't access it that way, I've put the address of our website, www.moresocialhousing.ca, on this slide. And if you go there, you'll see buttons where you can endorse the campaign, and under the Take Action page where you can fill out a form that'll send a pre-drafted letter for you. And so now, with the budget having been announced, and that was our focus in recent months, it's really time for our group to sort of regroup and refocus, figure out exactly what political moment we want to organize around next. We may start gearing up for next year's budget or do some planning to mobilize people. We're going to have a federal election, so maybe around that. But we need to re-strategize and develop plans now over the next year. And we're always looking for people to join our organizing committee and help with those discussions and help take on tasks to move our strategies forward. So if you are interested in joining the organizing committee, you can send us an email at the address on this slide here, shr@policyalternatives.ca. So that ends the slide part of my presentation, and I see that I've been going on for 38 minutes. So I maybe do a check-in to see if there is time for me. I can continue to chat and move towards what we've been doing here in Manitoba, or if you want, we can just leave it at that and open it up for questions right now.
Well, Kirsten, thank you for offering to take the questions and comments, and your presentation has opened so many doors for numerous possibilities. So thank you for that. And I suggest we move into some questions right now, and perhaps some of them will involve your work in Manitoba as well. Gracia Janes, past president of the EF, will moderate this section. Linda, president of Montreal, would you please assist Gracia and me by acknowledging the individuals who raised their hands and the orders they were received?
I can
And
see them.
Oh, can you? All right. Well, we'll
see
give
that
you
as long
a
as
hand
you
if we
put the
need.
reactions there and then you put your hand up. So I see Maria Peluso was the first hand I spotted, and then Lisa Tarko.
Yes.
Go ahead, Maria.
Yes, thank you very much. That's Maria Peluso from the Montreal Council. What concerns me, and I appreciate, and I'm pleased that the federal government, our Minister Fraser, is going all out to revamp the criteria for affordable housing, social affordable housing. What concerns me in our actions is that the provincial governments and the municipal governments are not responding. In fact, we have one provincial premier that doesn't want the federal money and wants to decide for themselves how they wish they're going to decide what is affordable housing. It's really problematic because we say that all levels of government must be involved, yet it's always falls on the federal government, which it should, don't get me wrong. But what is the provincial governments doing? And what about the city governments who are building condos and want the municipal taxes instead?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it is a huge challenge. I mean, here in Manitoba, we just had an election in October, so we had a conservative government for several years prior to that, where we didn't have a lot of interest in making investments in social housing here. And so we didn't see a lot of action, and it was a real missed opportunity to partner with the federal government and the programs that they have available at the table. And what ended up happening was our city of Winnipeg, which I know it's different all across Canada, but our municipalities in Manitoba have very little revenue generating capabilities in terms of being able to make their own investments in housing construction, and they certainly don't have the revenues to do operating subsidies. But it was the only level of government here in Manitoba that was willing to partner with the feds. And so because of that, we were able to get some dollars here in Manitoba with the feds just bypassing the provincial government. And now, we had the election in October, and we now have an NDP government who says that they're more interested in collaborating to bring more dollars to Manitoba. But we had a budget in April, and there was not, there was more than what the previous government did, but still, only meeting about the third of the need here. So I think it's really important, like I said, our campaign is targeting the national government, but it's very, very important that we have groups like the Right to Housing Coalition here in Manitoba that are doing that advocacy locally and putting pressure on provincial decision makers and their municipal decision makers to make the same types of investments and not lose out on the opportunities that are created from the programs that the federal government are implementing.
Thank you. I'll call on Lisa Tarko, another Winnipeg person. He's just getting.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Tarko, and I know Kirsten, she's been at our council many times doing presentations for us. In Winnipeg, we are taking this issue very seriously with Council of Women of Winnipeg. We've had many presentations on housing as a human right on all aspects of it. Particularly, what's important to a lot of Manitobans is nonprofit housing. We had an issue that happened here where a large apartment complex owned by the Lions Club was sold. And if the seniors who were subsidized in there wanted to stay, their rents were going up ridiculously. So they rallied around, they got a report, they got CCPA involved, the Manitoba Research Alliance, there were rallies and all that. And there's nothing they could do for the sale. What happened was Lions Place got a Lions Club got a profit of $22 million out of that sale. And at the time that this happened in 2023, the provincial government, which were the PCs, they gave $1.2 million to subsidize the rents of those living there. So they have a 2-year reprieve before they move out. There's very little housing. We have lots of apartment blocks going up, but they aren't geared towards income. So what happened was 2 things happened. The government decided to make an announcement. I don't know if you call it legislation, that no nonprofit housings will be sold. And unless it goes through the government in that. They are giving funding for operating of these nonprofits. They're giving some funding. And right now there are 8,050 units that are coming up under that umbrella, that 30-year umbrella. So they can't sell off or anything, and the government's dealing with them. Another thing that happened was out of the sale of Lions Place, there was a report generated. And what the report says is organizational elder abuse. The sale of that place was organizational elder abuse. So it's quite a issue here, especially for seniors. And then the government also agreed that they have a lot of Manitoba housing units that are in ill repair. And they have committed to get them fixed up and get them back out and rented again. And so that is what's happening here. I do have a question though for Kirsten, and I'll cut and then I'll be done. In your report, you said the federal government is giving $1 billion for 5 years across the country. Now, how is that money being distributed? Equally or by population? And that is my question. And thank you for letting me speak. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you, Lisa. Thank you for that. So it's a good question, and I don't think there's a specific answer to it yet, but what you can do is, so you can go on to the National Housing Strategy website, and it actually shows you, because this isn't the first time they've invested this $1 billion into this specific program. In the past, it was called the Rapid Housing Initiative. And you can go online and it will show you how that the $4 billion that has gone into that program already, it'll show you exactly how many units in every province were created through those programs. And I don't remember any of the details off the top of my head because I have looked at it, but not very recently. But you know, it's places like, I think Quebec for sure, because there's a strong interest in social housing there, and Ontario, and I think BC, and maybe Alberta, where we see a higher amounts of units that were created through that program. But really, the way that program has worked has been based on where there's been the most interest and capacity to add new social housing units. But so I don't know if there are in the program itself details that provide direction on how much can go to which communities. But you can find that information online on the National Housing Strategies website. And I would look at the Rapid Housing Initiative to get a sense of where this 1 billion over 5 years is going to go. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Sheila Pepper, did you have your hand up for question there? You're muted, Sheila. You're muted. Can you get unmuted?
Yes, okay, I'll go ahead. As I say, I just want to upstage Marianne. One of the things that I'm involved in is about 4 or 5 of these affordable housing initiatives across the country. And you mentioned several that you have been connecting with, which I'm very pleased to hear. And are you connecting with them about the campaign, or just asking them to join yours? Because there are at least 3 or 4 other national pushes for these campaigns across the country. And also this money, of course, is promised only if we re-elect the federal government. So it's important to find out from the other parties just what they intend to do and when. And of course, that may not come up until a while from now when the federal election process gets underway. So I just would like to know about your connection with the other housing networks and how you are joining with them on their campaigns, as well as asking you to join them. You know, we tend to divest the money through so many organizations that are doing much the same thing.
Yeah, so I thank you for that. Are you just want to make sure I'm talking about the same organizations you're talking about? Are you thinking about like the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and the Canada Housing and Renew? Yeah. So and I agree. So that was really important to us when we first started here in Manitoba, saying like, oh my God, we need to get back on to advocating to the federal government. Surely there are already national groups doing this. And so we went to those groups and others to sort of find out, well, what are you already doing about social housing? And so social housing was a piece of their platforms among many other priorities. And so what we talked about doing was ensuring that what it is that we say about social housing across our coalitions is consistent, right? So that we are advocating with one voice when it comes to social housing. But we don't expect all those other organizations to only talk about social housing, because, you know, CHRA wants to talk about specific needs for the nonprofit housing sector, and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, they also want to advocate to the feds around you know, initiatives around meeting the immediate needs of people who are experiencing homelessness in terms of support workers and access to mental health supports and safe shelter spaces. So all of those groups are part of our organizing committee, or have endorsed our campaign, because they see the value in there being a campaign that's focused only on social housing and how it helps them to meet their objectives. And we, you know, in turn support the work that those coalitions are doing and are trying to amplify their specific calls that are focused on social housing. So we do need to get a bit better in terms of when we are putting out our communications to government, but also to the general public to be complementing each other and highlighting each other's work. We're already doing that to some degree to sort of reinforce what everybody's doing. But we were sure that, and we are sure that, you know, we're not duplicating you know, efforts that are out there, in the sense that there is no other group that is only focusing on social housing. And so then, you know, when the budget came out, for example, we could really highlight, okay, this is what the budget said about social housing, and only focus on that. Whereas with other campaigns, because it's only one piece of it, you know, they're doing analysis on a whole bunch of different issues, and social housing can get lost in that. So it's good to sort of have multiple voices who are maybe bringing focused attention to different pieces of the puzzle that we need to be sort of investing in to make a difference. And then in terms of other parties, like, it is a huge threat, right? That if we have a change in government, what is it going to mean for this? The National Housing Strategy Act, the legislation, does require the government to have a housing strategy. Now, it doesn't say how much money needs to be invested in, or, you know, what kinds of programs it needs to maintain. So that will very likely change under a new government. But I mean, that's just that's just how it works. So as part of our advocacy, like, we are not just meeting with Liberal MPs, we have reached out to MPs across all political parties to let them know about the campaign and try to have meetings with them to talk about, you know, the importance of what it is that we are advocating for, so that, you know, when we do have a change in government, then at least they're aware of it. And that's really all we can do, right, is get on the record and try to build as much public support to put that political pressure on whichever government is in power to make these investments.
Thank you.
Marianne? You're muted. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm president of the Council of Women now, and I really appreciate this. I've had a lot to do with housing over the years. I chaired Ottawa Community Housing for some time. I was instrumental in getting 83 units of social housing on our church property, which is all renting and security income, things like that. And what I've noticed in this new programs, first of all, that the federal government can only do capital because technically housing is provincial under our constitution. In the province of Ontario, it's terrible that way. They dumped everything on municipalities. That was what Ottawa Community Housing now has, without fixing it after 40 years old. And it's been a constant battle to maintain it. But it has happened. But the city of Ottawa has put money into housing. It's one of the municipalities that has. And to do that, to get the funding for some of these programs, I don't know if you know this, municipal councils had to pass a bylaw that would say that any property can have 4 units. So if you have a single family house on a lot, if you can fit them in, you could have 4 units on there. If they didn't do that, they didn't get any funding. So some of the funding allocation is based on the fact whether or not the municipality has passed that bylaw. Ottawa has got some of the funding. I think the stuff that's going into the builders to reduce their costs is a waste of money, frankly, because you're quite right. It doesn't serve the need. The need is for affordable housing. And we really have to pressure more on that. And it's related to what they call the financialization of housing, which has caused the huge increases recently, particularly. I did submit a paper from a national council to the National Housing Council that they set up, was doing some research on that last year. So I thought that there's some things there that perhaps we can build on more together to work on getting not just to put more money into affordable housing, but to change the parameters of the existing agreements that money they're allocating, to have it go where it should go. And that's the biggest part of the money. And that's what we need right now. So if you have ways that we can help you in doing that and getting to the government, we're working on right now on pornography for children, but housing has always been a big issue with the National Council as well. And we're particularly always interested in serving those in need, because they're the ones that have a hard time helping themselves. So any advice you can give us that way, and we're glad to support your program. I'm not sure if I have yet or not. I'm pretty new. I was out of council for 20 years because I was on the municipal council and working on this on the other side of the fence. But there is a lot. This is obviously one that it matters to people, and that's important.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, so that like this is the problem, right? Is we do have a lot of money that governments are investing in housing right now, and they're coming to different levels of government locally to really like implement, and in many cases it's going to require cost matching from those levels of governments or other requirements, like you talked about the bylaws, right? We had the same thing here in Winnipeg, and our council passed that as well. And so the feds are implementing programs with all types of different conditions and requirements that they're putting on provinces and municipalities, but what they're not putting a condition on enough is ensuring or requiring that the units that are built with these dollars are rent geared to income units. Like those are the units that are going to meet the needs of those who are in greatest need of housing. And we only have one program out of an $80 billion national housing strategy where there is a requirement that if you're going to use the funding in this program to build housing, it has to be rent geared to income housing. That's the Rapid Housing Initiative that I talked about. And like I said, they've only invested $4 billion in that program. And so we are like, that's part of the goals of our campaign, is to see a larger portion of the funding that is being distributed from the federal government to provinces and territories to build housing to come with the condition that those dollars can only be used if they're going to go towards rent geared to income housing. We need a larger.
Ontario seems to want to put it into ownership housing and new green fields and all the things that are the most expensive housing they can ever build. And people who have money can still afford to buy it, and builders can still build for them. So my feeling is that the builders should be building for the low income people, being paid the money that they need to get till they get their profit, but have them then operated by a nonprofit group so they stay that way. And the government hasn't done that. And the programs are huge amounts of money that is actually going to basically subsidize the higher income people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So I have a chance to answer questions, or not to answer it, to make a statement, perhaps, to ask a question, actually. I've been in this for a long time too, and through social planning councils and councils of women. And I remember a conference we had in 2003 or 4. I'm not sure which year was the year of homeless for the shelter for the homeless internationally, but it was in that year that CMHC decided to back off. The federal government decided to back off, and the provincial government, of course, follows. And we had this conference with all those levels of government, and it was so depressing to read what was happening right there in front of us. Before that, according to Michael Shapcott, who's quite an expert on housing and in Ontario, he presented to us 3 or 4 times, and he always talked about the 10,000 homes per year that were being built always, and it was under the NPH sort of mandate before they started the cutbacks. So we've been falling behind over the years because of that. And that seems to be such a shame. Now, the other day we had a meeting in St. Cat, well, by Zoom, so it was everywhere. But the message that came through that it should be non-political, non-private, and that it should be public, non-profit. And so my question to you, what has happened to the cooperative housing? In St. Catharines, we're actually building one for the first time in many years. There was an re-infusion of money to the existing nonprofits, and they're very geared to the whole picture of why a person needs housing, what's important about the community, what's important about the housing part. So, have you got an answer for that? Do you know what has happened to the cooperatives? Because they were a super way, and some of our people, one of the men was talking about the Lions Club and the different clubs that did support community endeavors. So it was everybody's endeavor at that point. So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for raising the question around co-ops, because it is another piece of our puzzle when it comes to where we want to see housing providers to be supported to provide rent geared to income housing. But it has played a smaller role in the advocacy that I have done, right? So at the national level with the Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign, like we don't have any organizations at the table that are focused on co-ops. I know the Canada Housing and Renewal Association, they promote the need for community housing, which would include co-ops. So I think some of the focused advocacy that needs to happen around co-op housing development will come through the work of the CHRA. There's also the Canada Housing or the Co-op Housing Federation nationally that has regional organizations that is focused very specifically on co-op housing development. And so I think it's worth checking in on what they're advocating for right now. And then here in Manitoba, like co-op development in general has been, quite strong over the years, and co-op housing as well. And we do have like a local co-op housing federation, and they've just recently started to sort of get connected to the work that we're doing here in Manitoba when it comes to advocating for social housing, because when we do that, that includes, public housing providers, nonprofit housing providers, and co-op housing providers. So we haven't looked specifically at, what are the unique demands or supports that co-ops need from our governments to develop. And so for us, it's that high level commitment from government to fund capital and operating for housing providers to develop rent geared to income housing, whether it's a co-op or a nonprofit or our own Manitoba Housing owned units. So that's the piece of the co-op housing development puzzle that we are working around. But in terms of
the co-ops, there's a co-op we have on our property. The co-ops are the cheapest ones to operate.
Marianne, we can't hear you.
The co-ops are self-operated. So the cost of operating them is much lower than the normal public housing ones, which I've also been involved in. And that one was one because they self-operate themselves and they need to have some assistance with the major maintenance. But most of it they do very much themselves, even though the housing costs that are there are the subsidies to the families in there in order to be able to keep it going. And I think there's going to be a big push for it because it's a cheaper way of getting more housing and better housing too, because small communities.
I would like to support Marianne. It's Maria Peluso, again from Montreal. And I started a housing co-op many years ago here in Montreal. They're non-existent now. There isn't any motivation for social housing. There has been bylaw changes that developers, a certain percentage of whatever they're building in their condos must be for social housing, but that requirement is never implemented. They simply pay the fines. As I mentioned earlier, it's a complex issue because cities want taxes, and they get the maximum taxes by building condos, which are very, very expensive. Nobody can afford it. That's not social housing. And whereby their idea of a certain percentage could be applied for social housing, that's never implemented. The developers simply pay the fine, and we don't have social housing. So I go back to what I said earlier about I'm very pleased with the efforts of the federal government. I'm not so pleased with the reactions of the provinces or the municipalities. Not at all. And I don't think we can deceive ourselves into believing, even with the change of government, if we have a change of government, that the current initiatives are going to be maintained. And I'm very concerned about that, because certainly none of the provincial or many of the provincial premiers are not keen on social housing. They're conservative premiers, and the municipalities want to continue to feed the developers. The other problem in Montreal is abandoned buildings. These slum landlords who just do not take care of their buildings, they burn down. They want them to disintegrate. And then either they collect insurance money if there's a fire, Okay, so I'm not pleased with the municipal and in particularly the provincial governments across this country.
But I might just jump in to say too, though, like what you're talking about with the municipalities and the provinces, mostly, and trying to incentivize the private sector, develop this, and a certain portion of it needs to be rent geared to income. It's not working. That is what the federal government's national housing strategy very, very largely is doing. It's loans and grants to the private sector to develop housing, with a certain portion of that housing being affordable. And as I went over in the slide, it's generating affordable housing at $2,000 a month, right? So it's the exact same thing is happening at the federal government. We are not happy with what the federal government is doing either. And the issue of, slum landlords in we have all these a lot of poor quality, low income housing that is available in the market here in Manitoba, is through our private housing providers. And so that's why we are so focused on, we need to move away from like relying on the private sector to meet these housing needs. We need to stop giving, rent subsidies to people to go rent in the private market, because there is no accountability in the private market unless you have really strong rent and tenant protections in your provincial legislation. And nowhere do we have it in a way where people can go and rent in the private market, and we're holding that sector accountable for the type of housing we're providing. So we have a really strong rent benefit here in Manitoba called Rent Assist. People can get almost $1,000 to go rent in the private market. And that's thousands of dollars that's going in the pockets of our private landlords, of our public money, where there's zero accountability for the quality of the housing we're providing. So we really want to see that public money going towards public and nonprofit and co-op housing providers, where it's easier for us to hold those providers accountable for the quality of the housing that they're providing, and the rent levels that they're providing. Because a lot of those programs that say, oh, private developer, here's some money, build your property. We want 20% of your units to be affordable. And only for 10 years. After 10 years, you can increase your rents to whatever you want. So again, all this public money going to support a private developer when the 10 years, if they even, do it, like you said, a lot of them are just paying the fines for not following through. Those that do, after 10 years, they jack up their rents, and then they have their asset and are able to continue to benefit from the public money, and the community is no longer able to benefit from, the affordable units that they did provide for the 10 years that they were required to. So
I want to know, Christian, I thank you very much. And I agree with you. It's a horrendous problem. One of the things that CMHC did at one time in the 70s, when I started my housing co-op, is that CMHC would guarantee a real low interest rate on anyone or any group who wanted to start a housing co-op. And I'm with Marianne, because housing co-ops are in the hands of the people who live there. And they're in the community. It's community-based, which is great. But that's a suggestion that CMHC should go back to anyone wanting to start a housing co-op to be given really interest rates that are very low. If you can believe it, at the time we had a mortgage of 2% in terms of interest for the housing co-op. And that provided an incentive. You see, the incentives to start for ordinary people to start housing co-ops. And of course, approved by, the municipal and the provincial bodies. But in any case, I agree with Marianne, cooperative housing is one of the options. It's a very good one. It puts the power back in the people who live there.
I won't respond because I see Lisa has her hand up again.
Yes, there's a different thing going on in housing. I don't know if it's anywhere else, but I know of several of them here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba. And what it is, and it's mostly with retired women. And they get into, somebody has a big house, they all go in as like a co-op or communal living. They have their own rooms and all that. These women can't afford rents at all. So what they do is there's several people who have done them, and they open them up to other women. And it's to help fight this crisis that is going on, because the rents are out of control, and it's something to think about, communicable. I don't know what would be the right word for that housing concept. And it's no different than what they're doing here, and they're proposing here in Winnipeg. They're doing a housing complex. We have a lot of issues with our downtown, and they're redoing a whole mall they built down there. And everything's going to be wraparound services now. So they're going to bring them off the streets. They're going to house them in one tower. The thing is going to be all healthcare, social services, and it's a different way at looking at housing. Instead of individual suites, it's a different concept altogether, but it still is housing, because the issue with the housing is homelessness, and that's our biggest plight here in Manitoba. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gracia, and thanks to each of you for your very thoughtful comments and questions. And just this morning, CBC reported that the Canadian press asked each province whether it agreed with Canada's housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, that housing is a human right, and whether they intended to pass legislation guaranteeing that right. For the housing advocate, this means meeting and listening to unhoused people and trying to find them housing adequate to their needs, rather than deciding what is best for them without their input and leaving them to settle with temporary measures like shelters. She also went on to say that human rights also includes providing heat, electricity, and toilets to people living in homeless encampments if adequate housing is not available. Now, most provinces did not respond directly to the questions and instead listed a long list of initiatives that they launched to handle the brewing housing problems. But Houle reminded them that under the bilateral agreement, every province signed on to it in 2018 that they would adopt a human rights approach to housing. So it's a matter of how do we hold them to account at this point in time when there's still no legislation after all this time. It's an interesting situation for sure. But Kirsten, we do appreciate all your comments on all of this. There's so many things we could go into further, but right now I'd like to invite Sheila Pepper, our board member, to formally thank you for your presentation today.
Yes, Kirsten, thank you. You've really covered so many bases, and it's really important to hear all of your work that you started in Manitoba and Winnipeg and extended right across the country. It's wonderful that you had that gathering of so many organizations and groups, and that you're responding so well to all of the needs of homeless people and addressing this. Certainly the co-op and the co-housing, and I'm sure you've heard of NORCs, NORCSs, the naturally occurring residential areas. that is such an important situation to have more of those built. And we need to have a streamlining of the zoning applications, the changes to the processes to shorten them up and provide incentives to developers who really want to do the low housing, and they're having to compete with the market-based ones. And so we need more incentives. And I really thank you for your campaign to increase and help so many of the people who are in great housing need across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to be able to connect with all of you. And maybe we'll see you around the social housing and human rights campaign table one of these days.
Sorry, now I'm the one who's muted. In closing our session today, I wish to sincerely thank our guest presenter, Kirsten, and also extend a very special thank you to Linda Serponi and Penny Rankin from LCW Montreal for their assistance in promoting and facilitating this event. I would also like to thank and appreciate each of you for sharing your time and thoughts with us today as we follow through on Kirsten's ideas and do indeed mobilize to change. Our next presentation, sponsored by the EF, will be at the AGM on June 1st. Our guest speaker will be Ricardo Trajan, a political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I believe you will find his presentation to be interesting, informative, thought-provoking, and yet another impetus for us to continue our work to ensure our common program of housing is a human right, echoes all across our country. Now, if you have any suggestions for other presentations on our theme, please contact me or any one of our board members. And thanks again. It's been wonderful to spend a lovely afternoon with like-minded people who are dedicated to working together to improve the lives, the quality of lives for women, children, families, and all of society. Best wishes until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kirsten. And I hope we do meet again to support you. Turn the recording.